The difference between Trump and Europe is that Trump tries to provide a response while the Europeans don't even try. They are out of the game from the very beginning. So therefore, you don't even notice that they don't understand anything. And the problem is that we understand the idea, but I'm not sure that the Biden administration, including the Biden team, I would say, understood the very nature of the problems. And that's very obvious with Ukraine, that the special envoy, who used to be Keith Kellogg, has been replaced by Steve Witkoff, because obviously Keith Kellogg didn't had the right understanding of the problem. It's not, and hence, of course, of the possible responses or solutions. Because, as I always said, from the way you understand the problem comes the way you solve it. And if you don't understand it, there's no way you can solve it. And that's exactly the problem Trump has. By the way, he is not the only one. At least he would like to solve the problem. But you have an equally misunderstanding from the European side, for instance, from all the conflict. They don't understand the conflicts. And therefore, but they are not able to provide a response. The problem is that on the side of the US, they would like to solve the problem, but they don't understand its complexity. And we have seen that with the various attempts to have a ceasefire and to link that with the Black Sea Initiative and all that. But they understood that the problem is deeper, requires more attention, cannot be solved in 2 or 3 meetings, and that the view of the Ukrainians and the Israelis the Russians need to be harmonized, and they don't know how to address that. And my expectation was that the Trump administration would say, okay, the war in Ukraine was Biden's policy, not Trump's policy. And therefore, we tried to solve the problem that was created by the previous administration. And that's probably what the Trump administration still has in mind. They don't consider that as their conflict. That's why they are not afraid of a defeat, because that would be the defeat of Biden. The problem is that since they haven't found the right response to this complex situation, slowly they are this is becoming their conflict as well. Had they achieved a positive result very quickly, but that was not the case because Keith Kellogg had no understanding of the conflict, in fact. He had solutions without understanding the conflict. And therefore, the Trump administration will not have the same freedom. Because if you say that's the problem of my predecessor, then you have all the freedom to solve it. Once it's your problem, once you create some complications within the problem, then it is more difficult to distance yourself from the problem. And that's a little bit where they are. As a result, the Trump response was delayed, and the more it's delayed, the more it will be Trump's conflict as it was Biden's conflict. So we had this game of diplomatic relationships, and today, the Washington Post made last year, I'm making a lot of publicity for the Washington Post today, but last year, that was in August or October or so, the Washington Post published an article about sanctions and all that. And you could see on the graph, they showed that the first country that applies the most sanctions in the world is the US. And the second largest country that applies sanctions is Switzerland. And that's extremely strange. It's totally unexpected. And it's also something that shocks the Swiss. But it's not just because Swiss is a neutral country, but because sanctions have become, as I said, a substitute for diplomacy. That's certainly an evolution that is, in fact, institutional and could be changed. And apparently, we are not going in an improvement on that direction. Sanction has been a substitute for diplomacy, in fact. And that's the first strange evolution that we had in the last, I would say, 20 years. And that applies, by the way, to Switzerland also. Switzerland was known for its diplomacy, its ability to deal. And when we talk about Iran, that the US interests in Iran were represented by the Swiss embassy, and vice versa. The Iranian interests in the US were represented by the Swiss embassy in Washington. First of all, when we talk about sanctions, there is something that strikes me, is that I have the feeling, not only me, but I have the feeling that sanctions has become the ultimate foreign policy tool that we have in the West. As soon as someone doesn't behave as we want or doesn't accept what we want, and that applies to Hungary within the European Union. Hungary has a different view as alliance, so they apply sanctions. But there's a second aspect that you address. This is the problem of the mindset. And as I said before, in the West at large, we have the sense or sentiment or the idea that because we were successful in building up our countries and because our countries have ruled the world to some extent for a couple of centuries, we have the feeling that we should decide for others. And we don't understand other type of mindsets. And it's interesting to see, by the way, I just quoted this article from the Washington Post or New York Times on the secret war or secret implication of the US in the Ukraine conflict. But and in this article, it was said that the Americans were surprised that the Ukrainians didn't accept all the advice of the Americans, because they think we have a good advice, so they should accept it. And I think that reflects exactly the way Americans and Europeans at large, Western countries at large, address the rest of the world, because they feel they have democracy, because they feel they have a very high standard of living, because they feel they ruled the world for several centuries, then they are entitled to decide for others what they have to do. And therefore, since then, it's very difficult to have someone reasonable in the US that has the willingness to open a dialogue with the Iranians. And that's a pity, because the Iranians could be the best ally of the Western world in the Middle East, and a factor of stability as well. Geographically, that it has a key position in the Middle East. It has now very good relationship with the second big player in the Middle East, which is Saudi Arabia, meaning that we have all the ingredients to have stability in the Middle East. The only disturbing factor is Israel. And Israel, the problem of Israel is that it doesn't have a foreign policy. It wages war. War is its foreign policy. And I think that's a little bit what we have. And as long as we keep to be in that mentality, we'll avoid the necessity of addressing other countries as equal. And that's very true with Iran. If you look at the fundamentals, and I have several friends who are Iranians, but if you look at the fundamentals, you will see Iranians is essentially probably the most Western-oriented country in the Middle East. It's a country where the population is extremely positive toward the West. And what antagonizes Iran to us is, in fact, because we have a threatening behavior. We threatened them since 1979. The Americans never swallowed the change of regime, the toppling of the Shah, and the new government with with Khomeini, and above all, they never swallowed the problem with the personnel of the U.S. embassy in Tehran. That remains here. As I explained many times, a security policy is based on two pillars: the foreign policy and your defense policy. And some countries, such as my country in Switzerland, but we are in Europe, obviously, we considered that foreign policy should be the main pillar of the security policy. And therefore, we developed the concept of security through cooperation, which reflects essentially that. Although we had during the Cold War, now it's not exactly the same, but during the Cold War, Switzerland had one of the largest armies in Europe. We have to see that, even if it's a tiny country. Israel, on the other hand, doesn't understand its security policy that way. It assumes that its geopolitical environment just want to reject Israel. And therefore, for them, everything that doesn't think like them is enemy. And therefore, the foreign policy of Israel never managed to have or to build up good relation with its neighbors. All the peace agreements you had between Israel and its neighbors, such as with Jordan or Egypt, they were all brokered by the US. It's not the result of the Israeli foreign policy. It was the result of the US foreign policy. And this is the kind of black or white understanding of the Middle East mindset, which is totally wrong. But again, I repeat, all the leadership and the majority of the population of Israel doesn't come from the Middle East. This is a population which is essentially Central European. Netanyahu coming from Poland, Smotrich or Ben-Gvir coming from Ukraine. So we have this kind of mentality that has any commonality with the Middle East. The security policy of Israel is based on the second pillar, which is the defense policy. And that's the reason why Israel is constantly attacking its neighbors, even endangering peace treaties it had with its neighbors, such as Jordan and more recently with Egypt. And therefore, here I see a chaotic approach to the situation. If we agree that, okay, Trump wants to stop these conflicts because he wants to focus on other issues, and the main issue he was mandated for is, in fact, to improve U.S. economy, which, by the way, is not going well. I can agree, that's fine. If it wants to settle these conflicts or impose even peace on this conflict, why not? The whole thing is that we see it's very hard to understand exactly what is driving the U.S. policy here. Because on Ukraine, obviously, there's some attempts to have negotiations and all that. But we don't see that on the Middle Eastern scene. And we have a very strong rhetoric. Ukraine receives a lot of weapons from the US. But even though the Ukrainians do things that the US don't want, the attack on Kursk, the attack on the Kerch Bridge, and all that. And that was, by the way, that appeared in the New York Times or Washington Post, I think, just a couple of days ago, that a lot of things that the Ukrainians do is, in fact, not against the will of the US. Although the US are the biggest provider of weapon, intelligence, and all that to Ukraine. So on the one hand, we see that, and by the way, Marco Rubio said that the Ukrainian war is a proxy war. So meaning that, you see, on the one hand, we have a proxy war where the Ukrainians do whatever they want, even if they don't, without the approval of the US. And on the other hand, we assume that the Houthis are the proxies of Iran, and we expect Iran or the Houthis to do exactly what Iranians say, but we don't want to discuss to the Iranians. So we see that we have a totally paradoxical approach to these conflicts. And we cannot accept the logic of one conflict that may apply to another one. And I think the difference here is that Trump believes in the balance of force and this kind of relationship between countries. And he understands that Russia is a strong opponent, and therefore there needs to be polite. He needs to be polite with them. But he still considers the Iranians are weak or not a kind of a negligible force, and therefore he tries to impose its will, which is not completely, again, we have here in strategic inconsistency, there is an operational consistency, because we see that, as I have said, Trump is applying the gunboat policy. That's what he has done in Panama. That's what he tries to do with Greenland, where he said that he may not use force to achieve his goal to have Greenland. And now he's trying to do the same with Iran. He said, if you don't do what I want you to do, then I will start to bomb you. So this is the gunboat policy. And I think that's exactly what disturbs most countries, and especially countries like Iran, which has a very mature diplomacy and has extremely positive and, let's say, constructive relationship with other countries such as China, Russia, and even Saudi Arabia. Meaning that you have, on the one hand, a country where diplomacy has been not only celebrated, but also used extensively, because it's a country that doesn't want to use force unless it is constrained to, as it had to do last year on 2 occasions with Israel. But on the Western side, and I include Israel in that because Israel is not a Middle Eastern country. Israel is a European country in the Middle East. With a European mindset, it has the same arrogance as the Europeans. It is ethnically European. It has nothing to do with this region, not from last year, not from 1948 and 2000 years ago. Israel has nothing to do with the Middle East, the Israel we know today. And it has exactly the same mindset. And this mindset is driven by arrogance. And I expected, given what Trump said in January as regard to the Ukraine conflict, that, and also what a senator, is no longer senator, Marco Rubio said, I expected the Trump administration being the occasion of a comeback of diplomacy on the international scene. But I'm not sure it's exactly that. We still have this kind of, it's not diplomacy, it's, as I said, gunboat policy, meaning that you impose by force what you want. And this is exactly what we see with the US. This is a little bit, and I say that because I come from a country which is very small, but which is also very arrogant. We have the arrogance of those who have been successful. When you are successful, and that's very true with my country, Switzerland, besides all the problem it has, it's a country which is essentially successful. We tend to be arrogant because we think that we have the ultimate recipe for success. That's exactly, in that sense, fortunately, Switzerland is not that big, but we have exactly the same arrogance as the Americans, because they have the feeling that they have the recipe for success. They are democratic, or supposed to, and they are successful economically. They have a strong military and all that, and that gives them the right, with quotation mark, to impose their solution, because they have the ultimate solution for problems. Instead, we have spent trillions of dollars and euros fighting people in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and all that. All the money that we have invested in useless conflict, China has invested in training of new engineers, in developing new infrastructures, in developing new technologies, in funding research and development and all that, because they didn't have to spend money for useless wars. And that's the problem of the West. So we see the point where the US realizes that it is or will be surpassed by China. And instead of saying, okay, we'll give it 5 years, but we will improve the situation in the West at large, not just in the US, we start trying to suppress China, because all that has the objective of suppressing the competitors. With China, it's obvious that China is an obsession from the US. And as I said many times, the problem here is that the US has not understood that they cannot discard competition like this, not at this stage, because China is inherently more powerful than the US. And when I say inherently, it means that it has a potential, not just the number of inhabitants, but an intellectual potential, a strategic. When I say strategic, I mean from a decision-making point of view. It has a potential which is much higher than the US. It has also a decision-making that China has an advantage, and Russia, by the way, to have leaders who are for a very long time in their position. Therefore, they can take decisions for the long run, not just based on a 4-year mandate, as you have in the US, for instance, and in most countries. Now, the problem is that the US, instead of deciding to improve, not to reshore production, but try to develop their engineering and productive engineering capabilities, they continue to produce a financial engineering capabilities. This is the problem of the West. We have economies that are based on financial engineering, and that's obviously less of how you see the future technologies and all that. Industrial engineering will still be needed. And since decades, especially in the US, nobody has really the decision to redevelop this industrial engineering. And you can say it's a lack of democracy. It's okay. We can discuss that. But from a strategic point of view, it gives those countries an edge because they are able to make decisions that will take effect in the mid and long term, which is not the case for France, for instance. If Macron makes a decision today to expand, for instance, defense expenditure, he will not even see the result of his own decisions. And even his successor may change the decision. Therefore, it's very hard in the Western systems to have a strategic approach. And that's the same towards Europe as well. Instead of having a strong West, US wants to have a strong US. Okay, MAGA. This is what Trump was. That was his program in the election. But he's weakening his allies. And it's not good because at the end of the day, US will not be alone in this, even if it finds enemies with Russia and all that. There is attempts to put tariffs on China, by the way, as last year, as the US imposed tariffs on Chinese imports. Europe has done the same. But that doesn't solve the problem. And today, you still have the automobile industry in Europe in crisis because trying to destroy the economy of others doesn't improve your own industry. So I think the path is totally wrong here. Instead of focusing on ourselves in solving the problem of our weaknesses, we try to weaken the others. And we are not really strengthening our own establishments, both political and economic establishment. And we see that in the whole of Europe, and the US is obviously more powerful, more exuberant, and more impulsive somehow. And that's the personality of Donald Trump. But if you look at Europe, you would say you don't have a very different mood in Europe. There is no real incentive to improve things in Europe. In fact, there's no strategies for that. And that, I think, is the challenge that the West has not understood. It keeps trying to fight problems instead of finding solutions for itself. And that's exactly what we are witnessing today with those tariffs, with those wars, with all that. We try, by the way, probably all these warmongering rhetoric is probably to avoid people to think about the weaknesses that we have in domestic issues. But today, we can assume that the rest of the world has the ability to have another perception of things and could help Israel having a better understanding of of the world. And the support that Israel could receive from the West, in fact, is not depending on the threat towards Israel. Regardless of the threat, Western countries would help Israel. So why is this permanent need of having an enemy somewhere to fight against? But how come Western leaders are not able to understand the situation a little bit better? It's always, of course, when you are in a situation such as the Israeli in Israel, they see the world from Israel. They see the world with their eyes. They have their own perception of things. And again, my concern is probably, obviously, it's directed at Netanyahu, but more importantly, it's directed at Western leaders who should have more distance, who should have kind of the overview on the conflict, have assessment based on a big picture, not just on what we would call in German the frog perspective, that from the bottom and you see the world from the ground and you see upwards. And obviously every country has its own frog perspective. But and that's the same what I've said many times as regard the Ukrainian conflict. We in the West have the privilege of being outside of the conflict, having the ability of looking at the conflict at a distance, meaning that we should have the ability to, as the football field, you should be able to see where the mistake is done by one party or the other, and to be able to cope with those mistakes or to address those mistakes on both sides, not to take side on the conflict. And that's, I think, it's a weakness of the West in those countries. They take side. They don't take advantage of being at a distance. And that explains why probably our diplomacy is totally ineffective. Had we some distance with the conflict, our diplomacy could then address both parties of the conflict equally and probably play the role as to mediate in the conflict, or at least to help creating a dialogue between the two. Fortunately, we have these countries. If you look at Iran, if you look at Russia, China, India, these countries have very powerful diplomacies. They have very intelligent, very smart diplomats. They have very active diplomacy. They are able to negotiate, even if they are party to conflict. They are able to play the role of mediators because they have this ability of what diplomats should have, in fact, which is to dialogue with people. But since we are parties of the conflict, we're not able to do that. Look at the situation. Again, I'm going back to Ukraine, but in fact, there are a lot of similarities between the conflict we have between Israel, Iran, Israel and its neighbors, and Ukraine and Russia. There are a lot of similarities in the way the West approaches things. But when we see, for instance, in the case of Ukraine, we have problems finding someone who could be the person who would talk to the Russians. We try with Emmanuel Macron and Kaja Kallas, who institutionally should be the right person to do it. She's intellectually not the right person to do it. Institutionally, that would be the person, since she is the foreign minister, if you want, of the European Union. But she's not intellectually ready to do. And even Emmanuel Macron is not. He believes he's the right person, but I'm not sure the Russians will accept him, by the way. So since we are parties in all these conflicts, we have closed all negotiation doors with others. We have isolated ourselves from the rest of the world. And that's a source of concern because we have no strategy, we have no goals, we have no means to address the situation other than sending bombers. And that's the recipe for further war. Diplomacy is precisely there to help solving problems when you have frictions. Diplomacy is there to help smoothing the line of contact between countries. But since the European diplomacy has not done that in the last 10 years, but on the contrary has been almost part of the warmongers, they are not able to have this diplomatic role and trying to promote dialogue, trying to promote contact, to find the positive aspects in different things. You can only build on positive aspects. You cannot just say everything is negative and that's it. That's probably what you have with the Russian diplomacy, but also with other diplomacies, that they try to exploit any positive aspect they have, because that's where you can build something on. The Western diplomacy is no longer able to do that. And I think it's a pity, and it's a danger. It's a danger. The way Donald Trump plays with these tariffs, it's almost as if the US were indispensable for the rest of the world. But in reality, the rest of the world can live very quietly without the US. And that's probably what is missing in the calculus of the new administration there. Because it's fine to have this idea that you want to reshore industry and production capabilities within the US. And if they can achieve, that's fine. But that will be done at a cost that will be borne by the US consumer. And I'm not sure it will improve the situation. Because when you say we want to put tariff on EVs, for instance, fine. And then you reshore EV production and you oblige US manufacturers or even European manufacturers to produce their EVs in the US. Perfect. But then when you start to have the components of these EVs, such as semiconductors, batteries, and all that come from China, meaning that basically you are not solving the problem. Because the reason why this production was outsourced to China and other countries, it's because it was less expensive. If you reshore, that will be expensive. And that will be even more expensive that you are putting tariffs on the components of those vehicles. There is a world outside the US and outside Europe, which is very strong, very capable, and that evolves extremely quickly. And even more quickly that they see that the protectionist behavior of the West is, how to say that, is trying to prevent the development of the rest of the world. And that's very clear with the use of the dollar and what we call de-dollarization, because we see that since the US has weaponized the dollar, then why do you still use dollars? Because 100 years ago, but probably 70 years ago, the dollar was an asset, was something that was reinsuring, that because it was related to the power of the United States, which seemed quite strong and for a long time. But today, having dollars means vulnerability. It means vulnerability towards the decisions that are taken in Washington, D.C. And these decisions may change from one year to another, because at the end of the day, it depends on who sits Oval Office. So we see that the US behave as probably it could have behaved in the late 50s or the 60s of last century, when they were the only producer in the world. Therefore, you could decide, okay, we produce that. And basically, since we are the only big market available, the only big producers, then we rule the world. But today, it's not exactly the case. And therefore, you cannot make your whole economy and your whole sovereignty, I would even say, in the hand of someone who may change his mood every second day. And therefore, you need to have stability. And to achieve this stability, you want to have partners that are stable and that have a stable decision making, that are predictable, because your economy requires this predictability in order to adjust development strategies, production strategies, and all that. And that's exactly what the West is missing today. It's stability. So you see, when you talk about goals, what goals are we talking about? And I think that's exactly what the West has as a problem. He doesn't know where to go. It used to be dominant in the second half of the 20th century. Now we see that this balance of power is shifting somehow, that the West loses its hegemonic presence, that China is challenging the European or Western production, innovation, technology, and all that, because China and other countries, by the way, because we talk about China because this is the obvious superpower, but right behind China, we have India. That is equally potentially a superpower with a lot of capabilities in terms of innovation, in terms of knowledge, and so on and so forth. So we see that this power that used to be in the West for centuries is now shifting towards the rest of the world. And still, the West has no answer to that. With Ukraine, we see that we are not achieving anything concrete. We supply weapons. We certainly help Ukraine to fight further. But does it help really Ukraine? Is fighting a goal in itself? It's a question. And when you go to Palestine, where are we going to? We know that the Palestinians claim having a territory is completely legitimate. That has been said several times by United Nations. Basically, the international community agrees with that. And still, we are not making not even the slightest move towards a political solution of the problem. So we know all that, but still there's not the slightest move towards the application of that. Therefore, you have a West that claims to be fighting for values, which, by the way, are never defined. If it's the freedom of press, I'm afraid that the freedom of press has been abandoned since long in the West, especially in Europe, more than in the US. If it's other aspects, we practice torture. We wage wars without asking anybody, without any mandate from the United Nations. We bomb people, we bomb civilians. We deliver landmines to the Ukrainians, anti-personnel mines, and that's obviously something that the Ottawa Convention wanted to prevent. So what are our values exactly? In Europe, Donald Trump is not a beloved president, was not during the first mandate and is not today. Remember that all the governments that were in place during the first mandate are almost the same today. They are not exactly the same persons, but basically you have the same political context, if you want. And therefore, they are not very keen to support Donald Trump. Obviously, Trump came with the idea of changing US foreign policy. It was the idea of having peace in the Middle East, peace in Russia or in Ukraine, in order to focus on China. China is obviously a bipartisan issue in the US. Everybody agrees that China is the competitor, and this has to be handled harshly. Regarding the situation in the media, my feeling is that, as we see today, we see that both in the United States and in Europe, people are a little bit upset at Donald Trump because of tariffs and all that. And in Europe, in the US, obviously, they elected Donald Trump, so probably they're happy having the policy that was developed by Donald Trump and his team. And because of the relation between Donald Trump and Russia, because of the tariffs policy and all that, I feel that a lot of media are pointing at the contradictions within the Trump administration and within the Trump policy. That's my feeling. So we have lost this ability to understand where is the problem, what are the root causes of the problem, to address the problem at root cause level. And therefore, since we are not able to do that, we just strike at the surface, but we have no impact on the genesis of the situation. And that's exactly what, in fact, triggered the terrorist attacks of the Islamic State in Europe, because Europeans who were not involved in Iraq before and in Syria started unexpectedly in 2014 to be involved there. And that triggered those terrorist attacks. And again, we are back to the situation which is quite similar to the situation we have in Ukraine, that the role of diplomacy has been totally forgotten. There's absolutely no way we can address a problem just as we did before, using diplomacy. We don't have the channels for that. Those channels have been destroyed since a long time. And we are not prepared for that mentally. As soon as something doesn't go exactly as we want, we just bomb them.